that the government of Canada wouldn't recognize that, as the government of the United States doesn't recognize it. And, it's kind of up to us, all of us who are trying to get the message out, to really keep applying pressure to policymakers and people who are deeply entrenched in health and human services in both countries, to push this forward as a more urgent agenda item in terms of policy. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, I don't think that's really an optimistic point of view. I think that's a realistic point of view. I think that a lot of people now are very adamant about having access to good cannabis, and they view it as a medicine. And even though we are encountering a lot of resistance, I think that the momentum has built up so much, both in Canada and the United States and all around the world. Really, there's so much interest in cannabis that it can't really be stopped at this point. I think that eventually the legislators are going to have to look at legalization. They're going to have to look at allowing scientists to do more research on this incredible medicine. And I think that the momentum is just going to keep up in 2017 and right through to 2018.
You are absolutely right about that. And I'm curious too about it seems as though genetics would really enhance research when you're doing human clinical studies. And Dr. Kushwaha, how do you think that might work?
I mean, absolutely. Just imagine if a clinical trial is being conducted with cannabis, whether it's CBD or just cannabis, and if you have the genetic footprint of the individual as far as their predisposition to all the adverse effects go, and you have the genetic footprint of their endocannabinoid system as well, then based on the outcome of the clinical trial, you can actually correlate that to the genetic makeup as well. And then what we are gearing towards is really a personalized medicine approach towards using cannabis. And that's the direction we need to go overall with medicine.
Can the genetic testing also determine to what extent someone might be deficient of cannabinoids in their system? Because we're beginning to find that a lot of people who have some neurodegenerative conditions or inflammatory conditions and autoimmune conditions, that one of the things they have in common is a real deficiency in the level of cannabinoids in their system. So would that help to determine what kind of deficiencies they may have?
I mean, absolutely. So when we are analyzing the entire endocannabinoid pathway, we are really looking at all the genes, and these include the genes that include the receptor genes, genes that encode for transporters and action, genes that encode for metabolism, cannabinoids, and even genes that encode for cannabinoid-related cellular processes. And when we are analyzing these genes, we are looking at the complete sequences of these genes in the individual. So it really allows us to even pinpoint to what extent the different components of the endocannabinoid pathway are working, if they're deficient in one receptor or not, what is the efficacy, and so on and so forth. So what we really get is a complete genetic footprint or complete genetic profile of their endocannabinoid pathway.
Wow. It's an amazing science. When I hear things like this, it makes me wish that I had gone to medical school so I had a full understanding about it, because I just crave the information. This entire science of cannabis is just so incredibly fascinating. And like I said in the opening, there are breakthroughs. It's a regular occurrence to hear about some new discovery about cannabis.
And just to touch on that, Snowden, on clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, as far as I know, that was first popularized by Ethan Russo, I think around 2004, but he's done a lot of work on it since that time. And the three conditions that he found to be associated with the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency would be fibromyalgia, inflammatory bowel disease, and migraines. And migraines in particular is very interesting to me, because I have many patients that come to me and they say that when they get a migraine, their migraine level is a 10 in overall severity. And when they use, say, a pharmaceutical like Imitrex to help reduce the severity of their migraine, they might be able to get it down, say, from a 10 to a 5. But I have some patients who tell me that when they use cannabis, it takes it down from a 10 to a 0 or a 10 to a 1. And in some of those patients, I feel like those are the patients that probably do have a genuine deficiency in cannabinoids to be able to respond to that. So, just putting into practice what Rahul is doing with these genetic tests, I would be very, very interested to take a subset of patients that I have who suffer from migraines and who get these dramatic reductions in their severity levels with cannabis, and to see what their genetic testing is. And my hypothesis would be that these patients who say that their migraine level goes from a 10 to a 0, I would venture that they would have a clinical deficiency in cannabinoids. Now, I can't confirm that until I do the genetic test with Rahul's kits, but I'm going to be very, very interested in testing some of these patients in the future.
And it seems that migraines and some of the neurological conditions that crop up in children, between epilepsy and autism, and then in older age, Alzheimer's and other degenerative brain conditions, it seems that a lot of those are, in a way, related to different conditions that are environmentally induced, if you will. And I was speaking with Dr. Christian Bogner about this a while back, actually, in one of our interviews. And, he was suggesting that cannabis is really helpful in protecting the brain from the toxins that can enter through other digestive problems. Have you found this as well?
Well, if you do look at some of the research, it suggests that THC can actually inhibit beta amyloid plaque formation, which is in essence the formation of Alzheimer's disease. So you're right, you're correct when you say that cannabis can be effective for neurodegenerative diseases, and in fact. When you do look at something like Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's is something where we do have genetic testing for. You can either be an APO2, APO3, APO4, and depending on which APO you are, we can determine what in fact your chances of getting Alzheimer's later in life are. And knowing that cannabis and THC in particular can inhibit beta amyloid plaques, then you could look at potentially developing something, say like a low dose THC with CBD. I'm only talking something like 2 or 3 milligrams a day, could potentially be like almost like when people take a baby aspirin to prevent some cardiovascular or cerebrovascular complications. You could take like a low dose THC CBD to kind of prevent some of these neurodegenerative diseases that people always get later on in life. So, if we can use some of the technology that Rahul has to identify these high-risk patients who are at risk of developing Alzheimer's or other, neurodegenerative diseases, then we can use cannabis as a medicine to help prevent that.
Wow. And Dr. Kushwaha, do these tests also include profiles that would lead to cancer and other diseases like that?
So just to add to that, we do offer other tests as well, and there's a particular test we offer where we look at the individual's predisposition to things like a lot of autoimmune diseases such as Crohn's disease, colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, so on and so forth. So as we were looking through the data that we have accumulated with all the patients, a key finding that we had internally was that all the individuals, or most of them, that showed very high predisposition to ulcerative colitis, they had a very unique genetic endocannabinoid pathway profile. And again, that's where it comes into play that perhaps the endocannabinoid pathway may play a direct role in predisposition even to things such as ulcerative colitis. the patient pool that we had was not really big enough to really infer and identify specific markers. But as we are gathering more and more data, I think it's going to become a lot clearer, and we will be able to identify those markers that perhaps correlate endocannabinoid pathway with ulcerative colitis and downstream with how the individual should be treated as well with cannabis.
I would think it'd be fascinating to follow the patients who have submitted for the test to see what happens to their system after they start taking cannabis. Are you following people after the fact?
Well, that's right. I mean, absolutely, we would love to do that. But again, as you can imagine, a lot of clinics that have ordered these tests for, let's say, ulcerative colitis, they are not prescribing cannabis to the individuals. So, I mean, if we had a patient pool that showed predisposition, we knew their endocannabinoid genetic profile, and let's say they were started with medical cannabis, then we could really follow them and make strong arguments and perhaps really identify markers that show very, very strong correlation amongst all the processes for the disease.
It's really fascinating, and I would think that if there are people who are submitting from cannabis clinics, and this would be a really good thing for people who are in practice, actually working with patients with cannabis, like Dr. Hart, and it would seem really useful for these clinics and doctors treating patients with cannabis to send their patients back after the fact. It would enhance the amount of data that's available for research purposes later down the road, I would think.
Totally.
Wow. Well, I don't know. It's really an incredible science, and I encourage people to learn as much as they can about it. And your books are available online, are they? Because I know you've got an ebook, Dr. Hart, right?
Yeah, I've got 2 ebooks available online. They're on my website, mikehartmd.com. So the first ebook is mostly on cannabis and chronic pain and how cannabis can be an alternative to opioids and how it's safer than opioids. And also, as we discussed, how it can be used to help patients wean off or at least reduce their use of opioids. And then I have a second ebook that's on cannabis and PTSD. And that's because cannabis has been shown in a small amount of studies to be an excellent medication for the treatment of PTSD. And I use it all the time with my patients, particularly in the veteran population.
Dr. Sue Sisley, if you know who she is, she's been spearheading a study.
Yeah, I do. I'm familiar with Dr. Sisley, and I'm a big fan of her work. She talks a lot about anandamide, and that's the molecule that a lot of these people with PTSD are deficient in. And anandamide is literally called the bliss molecule. It's something that makes us feel good, gives us a sense of well-being. In fact, that's the reason for the runner's high is the release of anandamide. And what they found in a lot of these studies is that patients with PTSD, there's over 50% there's an over 50% reduction in anandamide in patients with PTSD. And when you use THC, you can actually replace that anandamide. So like we were talking about earlier about clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. Well, patients with PTSD have an anandamide deficiency. And when you use cannabis, and particularly THC, then you're going to get that replacement of anandamide. And that's why so many of these veteran patients and patients who have PTSD are feeling better. And that's really what I talk about in the book. But of course, I talk about a lot of other alternative treatments as well, because it's not just cannabis that's going to help get over PTSD or anything else. It's going to always have to be a whole lifestyle and several other factors as well.
Yeah, and there's a big movement to raise awareness about cannabis, particularly in the VA policymaking realm. And we have a congressman here, Ruben Galeo, who's been advocating for the VA to loosen their restrictions on veterans who are finding success with cannabis, because often they lose their benefits if they actually opt to go that route. And tragically,